12,800 years ago. This is the mystery they were drawn to study. The episode called the Younger Dryas begins, and it begins with a collapse of global temperatures, a sudden deep freeze after the world has been warming up for thousands of years. During this period is precisely the period of the megafaunal extinctions, and it's after 11,600 years ago, after the end of the Younger Dryas.
Is the world about to experience a replica of the sixth extinction event? Let's find out as we unravel the scientists' terrifying warning about the Younger Dryas, the sixth extinction event. The Younger Dryas. Since 2007, the idea of the Younger Dryas has become widespread all over the world, and several researchers have presented their facts and hypotheses about the event. However, just in case the concept of the Younger Dryas sounds new or strange to you, I think we should pick things off the topmost layer and talk about what it actually means.
We've been around, modern humans have been around for probably a couple of 100,000 years. So the event that happened is called the Younger Dryas.
For some time in the ancient world, the atmosphere was warmer and supportive for several species of plants and animals, but things did not continue that way for a long period. Things suddenly changed, and the climate went into an unbearable state. This time of visible and somehow catastrophic change in the world's climate is known as the Younger Dryas. It was a period of excessive climate change which occurred about 12,000 to 11,000 years ago, and it was specifically characterized by the sudden dwindling of our Earth's temperature. Okay, I guess you would wonder how the name Younger Dryas fits into a temperature change. Well, before you conclude that the researchers picked the wrong name, let's see how the dots connect. For about 15,000 years, when the world's temperature was warmer and steadier, some cold-loving plants went into hiding and they could not be found anywhere in the world. One of these cold-loving plants is a wildflower called Dryas octopetala, and it is a white mat-forming plant in the family of roses, which only survives in extreme cold conditions. However, during the 1,300 years when the world's temperature plunged deep, the Dryas plant found its way back, and it grew in abundance all over the place. So, the fact that the Dryas plant loved the weather so much makes it obvious that it was just too cold for comfort. In fact, after research was made on the extreme climate change, scientists found out that the temperature dropped by over 10 degrees. However, the period also did not last for a long time because after about 1,300 years, the temperature rose again. So much that it soon became unbearable for the cold-loving Dryas. And, as expected, they disappeared again. Now, when you think about it, it looks like the extremely cold period was specially made for the Dryas, isn't it? Yeah, that explains why researchers decided to name the period after the plant that loved it the most, and they came up with the name Younger Dryas.
It's named after a flower called Dryas octopetala. Dryas octopetala is a polar wildflower that loves the cold. That it was growing in Europe during the Ice Age, when Europe was 10 degrees colder than now, and then it disappeared for about 1,300, 1,500 years, and then it suddenly came back again.
Another fact about this name is that scientists also believe that there may have been such a moment of extreme cold in the earlier years. Talk of thousands and thousands of years before the Younger Dryas. However, the exact time of this climate change wasn't well documented, and the scientists just chose to call it the Older Dryas, because it happened long before the most recent one, which they are all loud about today. According to researchers, one thing we can be sure of is that the temperature was even colder than it was during the Younger Dryas, and the ice sheets in northern Scotland were also thicker and more extensive during the Older Dryas. But we're not here to talk about the Older Dryas, right? While it is widespread knowledge that the period of the Younger Dryas was most favorable to the cold-loving plants, the story wasn't the same for trees and plants that did better in warm weather. So, as the Dryas flower and other plants in its class thrived, other plants went into hiding and they came back when the temperature became favorable for them. However, some of these plants did not survive at all as they went into extinction and were never seen from the end of the Younger Dryas until now. I think that makes the Younger Dryas a paradox in some way. I mean, it was both the beginning of some and the end of others. Oh! Talking about a paradox. You would be surprised that the Younger Dryas did not have the same effect on every country or city around the world. While Northern America was freezing in excessive cold, the Southern Hemisphere experienced warming around the same time. And a reverse of the case happened later on when Northern America was getting warmer. This weird situation of varying temperature was called a polar seesaw by scientists. And of course, the reason they chose that name is not far-fetched. I mean, it was indeed a seesaw in every sense of the word. What caused the Younger Dryas? Since the Younger Dryas happened at a time when there was really no advanced knowledge of science, it would be hard to tell what the exact cause was at the time. I mean, the ancient people who existed thousands of years ago would just wake up one day to an unbearable level of cold that they wouldn't have been able to explain. However, thanks to the new knowledge of science which now exists, researchers have been able to put some work into finding out what the cause of the extreme climate change was. And good for them, their works have proven to be fruitful. Though many schools of thought have come up with several hypotheses which suggest the cause of the Younger Dryas, only one of these is generally acceptable. One of the earliest suggestions is the fact that the Younger Dryas was triggered by a volcanic eruption. Alright, I know that's probably one of the weirdest things you've heard in a while, and you may be wondering why volcanism could have possibly led to the sudden climate change which was characterized by extreme cold. There seems to be no correlation between volcanoes and extreme cold. In fact, they are the exact opposite of each other. However, this school of thought seems to be very confident about their claim, and they have been able to explain why they linked the extremely cold event with volcanism. Well, it's ours to decide if their explanation makes sense or not. According to their research, they propose the possibility that a high-latitude volcanic eruption shifted atmospheric circulation and increased ice growth in the North Atlantic Sea. This ice growth then led to a cooling feedback which initiated the Younger Dryas. Right off the top, their perspective seems shaky, but surprisingly, they were also able to support their claims with evidence of a series of volcanic eruptions which preceded the period of the Younger Dryas. In samples gotten from ancient cave deposits and glacial ice cores, particularly the Greenland ice cores, a high level of sulfur has been found, and this gives credibility to the claim that volcanic eruptions indeed occurred at the time. In fact, the samples showed that the number of volcanic eruptions which preceded the Younger Dryas exceeds every other time in the history of the Earth. More specifically, the sulfur testing showed a high-altitude volcanic eruption occurred around 12,870 years ago, and the eruption was so large that it could have triggered the extreme cooling which followed about 30 years later. This suggestion of volcanic eruptions triggering the Younger Dryas event could also explain why there was a record of drastic changes in sea levels at the beginning of the climate change. And it can also be backed by previous works that link volcanism with other catastrophic events that look like the Younger Dryas. But regardless of the evidence and backings that this claim has, it raises eyebrows and also triggers a lot of unanswered questions. One of such questions is whether a series of volcanic eruptions that only happened for a short period of time can actually trigger the cooling, which happened for over 1,300 years. I mean, only one of these eruptions was recorded to be large, so could that be the sole cause of over 1,000 years of climate change? And while there were records of volcanic eruptions before the Younger Dryas, they have failed to prove that as a cause of the drop in temperature around the world. This is where the researchers in this school of thought leave us to determine if their claims are acceptable or not. What do you think? Tell us in the comments section. All right. While the first school of thought makes some sense and they sounded convincing in a way, their claim has lacked the backing it needs. So, as expected, their hypothesis is not as loud and widely accepted as the fact that the event was caused by an external body, which traveled from space and landed on Earth. According to this school of thought, a meteorite missed its way about 12,900 years, and it landed on the Laurentide ice sheet, giving rise to an ice boulder. This ice boulder then liquefied the ground, and that marked the beginning of everything that could possibly go wrong.
In some of the bone beds up in those areas, they've now discovered iridium, platinum spikes, which are delivered to Earth via cosmic impact.
When I said everything that could possibly go wrong, I meant everything. The meteorite and ice sheet saga, which happened behind the scenes, became visible in the latter days when the atmosphere became filled with fog of ice crystals, and the sun could no longer penetrate, because the ice crystals were so much that they blocked out the light from the sun. But, unknown to the people that probably existed then, that was just the beginning of their problems. And before these ancient people would be able to put a meaning to what was going wrong around them, the air was already saturated with ice crystals and an extremely unbearable cold followed. Thinking about it, that seemed like a more logical reason for an excessively cold temperature that lasted for over 1,000 years. But on the other hand, it was such a weird thing to have happened in a lifetime. I mean, how do you explain that the climate changed so suddenly that it seemed like everything just went wrong overnight? Though a lot must have happened behind the scenes before the effects became visible, it still doesn't cover for the fact that the Earth would have been caught in a shock. And the fact that the whole thing came with partial or total darkness makes it even weirder. Maybe it would also mean that the whole world was at a standstill until the end of the Younger Dryas. No doubt, a freezing temperature and darkness are such a match made in hell, and there is no way life would have continued the way it was before the event began. But you know what's more bothering? The fact that the catastrophe lasted for over 1,000 years. Just imagine that an anomaly occurs overnight, and we all wake up to a strangely cold temperature. Then, as if that is not enough, we find out that there will be no summer for 1,000 years, and the sun may never shine on the Earth again. And as the days go by, the temperature keeps dropping to the lowest point you can ever imagine. I mean, it's really as crazy as it sounds. That's somehow like locking up the entire world in a freezer, isn't it? And that would explain why the Earth is yet to recover from some of the results and impacts of the strange event. It also gives credibility to the hypothesis that the Younger Dryas was a cataclysmic event which wiped away every form of life at the time. However, this belief that the event wiped out life would be the reason why the idea of the Younger Dryas doesn't sound so great in the ears of a group of scientists. The impacts. As loud as the concept of the Younger Dryas is today, you would be surprised that it still remains a controversy among mainstream scientists. But one thing that should not come as a surprise is the fact that most of these scientists think it is impossible for a natural event like a sudden drop in temperature to cause partial or total extinction of life. For scientists, any idea that an event completely wiped out life is somehow unacceptable. This controversy among scientists is the reason why many of them have tried to write off the claim that such an event happened. However, the impacts of the Younger Dryas are written so boldly around us that we cannot deny them. Thousands of years after the Younger Dryas have come and gone, scientists have been able to trace some events to the period, and one of the most glaring is the loss of the megafauna.
Is that the mass extinction of the great megafauna that lived during the Ice Age, over 100 species of megafauna that did not survive the end of the Ice Age, right?
According to research, about 12 million megafauna of over 100 species were lost at about the same time. There has been prior research about this sudden extinction, but the mainstream scientists somehow did a lazy job, and they only managed to link this extinction of megafauna with human activities. They claimed that the animals were wiped out by human hunters who exploited them for food and other resources. However, this claim seems shaky because we're talking about millions of giant animals here. I mean, the extinction happened at a time when the entire population of humans in the world was only about 10 million. So this claim would only mean that the entire population of humans, including women and children, were bold and strong enough to enter the forest and hunt down giant animals. It would also mean that one of those humans hunted at least one mega animal in their lifetime. And even if they did, they still would not be able to take down the entire population of megafauna. So, this shaky claim totally lost its chances of being accepted when scientists traced the time of extinction of megafauna to the exact same period of the Younger Dryas. Now, the most valid claim would be that they were all frozen to death in the extreme cold. And over time, this claim has proven to be true, and evidence has also been found. After many years, archaeologists have been able to find fossilized remains of megafauna, frozen in ice, across various parts of the world.
On his land, there's a valley that's filled with permafrost. When you dig into that permafrost, half of it is the remains of extinct megafauna.
Apart from the loss of these megafauna, the extinction of the Clovis culture has also been linked to the same period as the Younger Dryas, and after several research was carried out, the claim was established that the humans were also wiped out alongside the megafauna. Now, this would really be a slap in the face of the scientists that claimed that the megafauna were wiped out by human activities, because if they were right, we should be able to blame some other higher and more powerful creatures for the loss of the humans around that time as well. Isn't it just easier to accept that the cold became too unbearable to both animals and humans? Or maybe they would blame aliens for wiping out the humans, since they blamed the humans for wiping out the mega-animals too. Anyway, whatever the mainstream scientists think of the Younger Dryas, this loss of a certain culture which has been traced to the era is enough proof that it was an extinction-level occurrence. However, the effects of the Younger Dryas were not limited to the extinction of life alone.
The last glacial maximum, 21,300 years ago, sea levels were 400 feet lower than they are today. There was no Red Sea, there was no Persian Gulf. That's because all that extra water was frozen up on these ice caps.
Another effect of the Younger Dryas that has left an unchanging impact on Earth is the rise in sea level. Before the period of the Younger Dryas, the sea levels were about 400 feet lower than what they are now. However, when the ice formed during the Younger Dryas began to melt, the sea level also began to rise drastically. One of the reasons for such change in sea levels is because the Younger Dryas was followed closely by a moment of great warmth. And you know what that means. The large ice that had formed over the waters during the Ice Age was melted by the new temperature, and the melted ice definitely added to the water volumes.
What happened around 13,400 years ago, there had been a period of global warming, and the ice sheets began to melt.
Another valid explanation for the rise in water level is that some large rocks have also been swallowed up in ice during the extreme cold, so when the melting ended, these rocks plunged deep into the depths of the waters, and they also raised the sea levels.
Turbulent flows of water filled with icebergs the size of oil tankers, and inside those icebergs, locked up, are huge chunks of rock. And eventually the iceberg melts and it releases the rock, and that's how you get the big stone.
Since the Younger Dryas was said to be characterized by suspended ice crystals in the atmosphere, the end of the Younger Dryas was also announced by excessive amounts of rain. I mean, as the ice in the waters melted, the ones in the air would as well, and this melted ice would fall as rain. However, since the ice crystals were in large amounts, the rate of rainfall increased drastically after the Younger Dryas, compared to the years before it. So, this sudden rise in the level of rainfall also caused an increase in the amount of water that flowed into the rivers and lakes, and this in turn contributed to the rise in sea level. I think we should also note that the rise in sea level had a lot of impact on human and animal lives as well. While a lot of humans and megafauna may have frozen to death, the rise in sea level also birthed several major floods around the world. As the waters rose and overflowed their banks, the possibility of a flood came into the picture, and now there is evidence of flooding, which started at the end of the Younger Dryas. So we can say that some of the remnants that survived the extreme cold had to face the flood which drowned many of them. At the end of the day, the Younger Dryas was one major catastrophe that did not end after 300 years. In fact, we should probably be scared of the days before us. I mean, if something like that happened without warning and left its impact after hundreds of thousands of years, what is the possibility that such an event may not repeat itself in the nearest future? Okay, before you conclude that I said that just to scare you, I think we should note that the Younger Dryas, which happened about 12,000 years ago, was preceded by a series of 25 to 26 major climate issues that happened over the course of 120,000 years. Some of these climate episodes that preceded the Younger Dryas also started suddenly and ended abruptly. But for those 120,000 years, you can say that nature was only giving signals of what is to come in the future. So, that said, should we hope that the future does not hold something more extreme than the Younger Dryas? I mean, we are not oblivious of the series of abrupt climate changes we have faced over a couple of centuries and decades, but have we thought about the possibilities of these climate changes being the heralds of a greater catastrophe like the Younger Dryas? Well, we all may find comfort in the fact that we live in an advanced world where science goes far ahead of us, and we all can depend on the knowledge of science to know what's coming and find solutions to them before they pounce on us. However, we can't be sure that a climatic mayhem like the Younger Dryas could have been solved by science. And even if it was solved by science, maybe our dear scientists wouldn't have been able to do anything about some of the impacts that followed. Anyway, we can only assume these things and try to make guesses, but who knows what really lies ahead? What do you think about the Younger Dryas? Do you think such an event may also repeat itself in the near future? Tell us your thoughts in the comments section below, and if you have any questions about this thought-provoking issue, you can tell us in the comments section as well.